Byzantine Empire and the Crusades. The objectives are: 1. Examine the unique civilization of the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. And 2. Discuss how the Crusades affected medieval society in both the East and the West. Now, first, when we begin to talk about the Eastern Roman Empire, we need to talk about the Western collapse. In the 5th century, Germanic invasions led to the collapse of that Western Roman Empire. Now, it was that the eastern portion survived and was able to maintain its stability due to its urban nature and also its wealth and its food supply and its standing armies. So the East was able to survive the Germanic invasions, which were largely focused on the western half of that Roman Empire. And the eastern half really saw itself as Roman. It didn't see it as not Roman. They didn't see themselves as something else. They saw themselves as Romans that had lost half of their empire. And we can really see this, and it's quite emblematic of this shift in idea. We could see it within the Emperor Justinian, whom was the Eastern Roman Emperor. He was crowned in 527, and he really sought and had a great desire to reconquer the West and to take those territories back, to take back Italy, which had been taken by a Germanic tribe known as the Lombards. And so, through military campaigns, he was able to conquer much of the lost territory. Conquered Italy, parts of Spain, northern Africa, Asia Minor, Palestine, Syria. He conquered a great deal of territory. But the problem is that as he was dealing with Italy in particular, he saw a rising power in the Middle East that he had to turn his attention toward, and ultimately then lost much of the territory that he gained. After his death, really, the Lombards took back all of those territories in Italy itself. But his legacy is still remembered as one of the great and last Roman emperors, even though he was an Eastern emperor only. Particularly, he's remembered for the codification, the writing down of the Roman laws. Now, the Roman laws had really always existed, but he was the one who actually had them written down and codified and created a book or a collection of the law called the Body of Civil Law. And really, this is the tangible embodiment of what will become the law in Western tradition and carry on for generations into Western tradition and legal basis. Now, we see a transition from Eastern Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire, a completely different identity. Now, really, trouble began to emerge in the Eastern Roman Empire. It had too much territory, it had too much to protect, and it was so far from Constantinople, that central locus of power in that urban center. And so during Justinian's reign, this was really one of the major problems. In addition, you had several other issues. In the Eastern Roman Empire, you had an outbreak of a terrible plague, sometimes called Justinian's plague. People believe that it was an early bubonic plague, Black Death, that will really come to Western Europe much later. You also had an empty treasury, not a lot of coin available to pay soldiers and pay bills and do those things. And this was really a weakening of centralized authority in the Eastern Roman Empire. But really, one of the death blows to the Eastern Roman Empire was the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam really rose in power in the East, and they had a great supply of gold that really allowed them to use both their economic power and their new religion to dominate the region. And they really had a strong push toward those lands that were once Roman. But many enemies to the north, south, east really all pressed in on the Eastern Roman Empire. And it really reduced and pushed back that Roman Empire down into its central areas. It was really by the 8th century that all that really remained of what was the Roman Empire, and particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, was the Balkans, that territory north of Greece, and really what might be considered Eastern Europe, and Asia Minor, that is Turkey. And really that territory itself was really all that remained. And this marked a massive transition from what was the Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire. Culturally, we see a significant shift. Politically, we begin to see a different shift. And so, while they still consider themselves Roman, and in fact considered to call themselves the Romooi, that is Greek for the Romans, we see a distinct new identity that began to emerge. But they still flourished in many new artistic and cultural traditions. We see art, church buildings. We see a different sort of expression of ceremonies. We see decoration that were really emblematic of the Byzantine faith, of that Eastern Christian faith. And at this point, they still considered themselves all Catholic. Everyone was considered Catholic. That is, universal. That's what the word Catholic means. Universal church. There was no Roman Catholic or Eastern Catholic. There was just Christians. That is, Catholic Christians. But we begin to see a different identity begin to emerge. The emperor really was seen, and this is completely different in the East, the emperor was seen as chosen by God, whose power was absolute. And since he was a Christian, there was no conflict between Christian leaders. But of course, the head of the church in the East, the bishop of Constantinople, or called the Pope of Constantinople, because Pope just means father, papa, the emperor appointed the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the patriarch, the father, the Pope. And so you had this sharing of power between the political office and the religious office in the eastern half of this Christian world, which is completely different than what we see in the western half of the world, where there is no king and no Christian king for a long time. And really the only person left to be in charge in Rome was the Pope. And so the Pope gained both political and religious authority. And so we see that there's going to be a tension between the two that will ultimately lead to a break. But really, life in Constantinople was complicated because it was such an urban center. Really, there was a massive riot that broke out in Constantinople in 532, all based around, actually, sports and games. It was a riot that was sparked by a team that lost, and all of these fans began to burn the city really out of displeasure for the lost, but the real issues, the deep-seated issues, were the same sorts of issues we're familiar with urban rioting, with disenchantment, disenfranchisement, with poverty, with all of those things. Now, afterward, though, Justinian rebuilt Constantinople, rebuilt the city, and built it such that it became the largest city in Europe during the Middle Ages. It was a cosmopolitan boom of economic prosperity and trade and wealth, and much building projects were going on, all fueled by the source of wealth, trade. Constantinople was a medieval center for trade, binding together two distinct different worlds, the Eastern world and the Western world, Europe and Asia. It really is this focal point between the two, where that Silk Road trade is really filtering through Constantinople. Now, some of the main products that were sold in Constantinople was the silk from China. We see spices coming from Southeast Asia. We see wheat and furs coming from Russia. We see flax and honey coming from the Balkans. Now, flax, of course, just so you know, is that it is a kind of a super seed. It could be used for food. It could be used for oil to burn, for lamps. It could be used to grow a a sort of cotton-like substance that was used to make clothes, and this is going to be replaced eventually by cotton. But for now, flax is incredibly important. But ultimately, we end up seeing in the long run monks eventually smuggling out those silkworms out of China that had really held the monopoly on silk. And it creates another center of silk production in Constantinople. And so it really diminishes the demand of Chinese silk. But nevertheless, people will still desire silk from China, but what will trump the most desirous item coming from the East is spices. Spices are only found, some of these incredible spices are only found in the East, and so they're going to be flooding and flowing to the West because there's such high demand. Now, building projects were quite immense as well. You have immense palace complexes. You have hundreds of churches. You have the Hippodrome, one of the most famous centers for entertainment. You have the Hagia Sophia, perhaps one of the most famous building structures in Eastern Christianity and Byzantine culture. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was one of the largest churches in the world. And was really considered the prize, the jewel of architecture in the East. And so this is, of course, a major project. Now we begin to see a new transition out of what was Rome and that budding Byzantine culture, and we see a transition to a new family running things. A new dynasty emerged, known as the Macedonians, who really ruled from 867 to 1081. And they really helped expand the shrinking empire that was being pressed in from all sides. And this Byzantine Empire, during this period, experienced a massive schism, a break between the Latin church, the Latin Christians, and the Greek-speaking Christians. Largely, this was over church authority and who got to be in charge. The Western Pope, the Latin Pope, is going to say, no, I'm in charge. I'm God's representative on earth, and you're not patriarch. You're subservient to me. And so this is largely going to be one of the major splitting points between the two. And it's at this moment, when the two split, they part ways, that we begin to talk about Roman Catholic, that is, the Latin tradition, and Greek Orthodox, the Eastern tradition. And so these two are going to split, and they're going to have conflict continually, theologically and politically. But of course, at the same time, we see threats also arose from military defeats in the East as new struggles and new powers arose through the Islamic faith, particularly the Seljuk Turks. They began to expand the Islamic territory into the Byzantine lands in Anatolia, pressing up into dangerously close to Constantinople. Now, the emperor at the time, Alexius I, sees only one solution: to turn to the Latin brothers, to the Latin Christians, and ask for help. And so he turns and asks for the Pope of the time, Pope Urban II, for help. And so this begins the most famous crusading era. From the 11th to the 13th century, we see European Christians carry out a series of military campaigns to regain the Holy Land. And these campaigns were called the Crusades. Various efforts to regain Jerusalem, to regain the Holy Lands, which really was, as far as what Alexius I really wanted, was a resurgence to push back the infidel, the Muslim. And so Pope Urban II declared war on the infidels, that is, those who are evil and come from the devil and don't believe in Christ. These infidels were defiling Christ and were defiling his land and defiling his body, that is his church, and defiling the bones of the saints that live in that land. And so this was, of course, a major drive, a major push. In fact, in his declaration for war to send Christians to the east, he said, "All who die, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins." His claim was, hey, you guys, if you go fight, even if you die in battle, you get into heaven immediately. All your sins are erased. You're free and you're able to get into heaven, no problem. Now, of course, this is going to be an incredible motive and spark an incredible fervor to go to the Holy Land, get glory, get money, have adventure. And if you die along the way, then you have an entrance into heaven. Now, these weren't, of course, the only motives. There were religious fervor, of course, but adventure, fighting, it gave an excuse to kill people. The riches, one could gain title. In fact, you could have some low-class person go to the east and fight and gain land and become a knight. And of course, many merchants wanted to go to the east as well because it was incredible trading opportunities. You could establish trade. Remember, because all of those trade routes are heading and hitting the eastern coast. So these early crusades exploded, and they really, in some senses, were unorganized and organized bands of people heading to the east. Now, there were three major organized bands of warriors, most of them French, during this first crusade, and they went and captured Antioch in 1098, and later transitioned and sacked Jerusalem, were able to take back the territory. And what they did then was created Latin crusader states, independent kingdoms ruled and ran by the knights that came to conquer the land. But of course, trade was the central, long-lasting legacy. Trade revived and was brought and filtered through Italian merchant cities, and this made them incredibly wealthy. In fact, brimming with gold and with spices and with wealth. And this will, of course, translate in the long run into why the Renaissance emerges in Italy, because you have exposure to new ideas coming from the Crusades, and also tons of coin, tons of money coming from the East through these Crusader states. Now, of course, in 1140, the Muslims strike back, and so begins a new movement and a call for crusade. In fact, it was a saint who led the Second Crusade, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a monastic leader. He called for renewed effort in leading another crusade. And through his efforts, his religious zeal, he was able to lead a new group of people to sack and destroy and kill the Muslims that had taken back Jerusalem. Now, ultimately then, we see the Muslims strike again and take it back again. In 1187, we see the famous Saladin sack Jerusalem and take back the states and take back the kingdom. And now we end up seeing another crusade called a Third Crusade, and it goes on and on and on. The Third Crusade was really led by European kings who banded together to retake Jerusalem, which they did, and then it was taken back. And then a Fourth Crusade was called, but then this time, the Crusaders on their way decided, you know what, hey, maybe we don't want to go all the way over there, we just want money. And so they sacked Constantinople instead, and took the gold there and went back. So you can see it just becomes this military campaign and becomes increasingly devoid in some senses of even the religious fervor, and it becomes kind of its own identity. Now, we end up seeing some strange even crusades that have nothing to do necessarily with taking back the Holy Land. Two of the more odd examples of crusades, though there are many, many, many examples. One is the Children's Crusade. One child claimed to have a vision in which Jesus came to him and said, "Take back the Holy Land, and you will go there, and they will convert to Christianity. You don't have to fight them at all. They will see the innocence of children." And so he, through supposedly, as the story goes, through several signs and wonders, ended up gaining a following of 30,000 children. And this leader child believed that as they walked to the sea, that somehow the sea would part, that the Mediterranean would part just like Moses had parted the Red Sea, and that they would walk across dry land all the way to the Holy Land and usher into God's kingdom there in Jerusalem. Now, of course, when he got there to the sea, it didn't part. But there were some people standing there that said, hey, we'll offer you free passage on our boats, all of you. Well, what they didn't know was that they were taking him to Africa and selling him into slavery. And so, as the story goes, 30,000 children, led by this religious crusader fervor, ended up in slavery in Africa. Now, of course, another example of extreme crusader ideas was the Albigensian Crusade. In fact, this wasn't even going to the Holy Land. The Pope Innocent III, declared a new crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to go kill people in France, the Albigensians, who were heretics. They didn't believe in the kind of Christianity that the Pope was pushing. And so he said, hey, guys, I'll tell you what, you go there, you kill them, you'll get into heaven, get your sins forgiven, and anything you find, you can keep. And so they marched in and started killing people. Now, famously, one soldier asked one of the main generals, hey, what do we do? I can't tell the difference between an Albigensian and a true Catholic Christian because they're both here. And his famous line was, kill them all, God will sort out the rest. And so that's what they did. They killed every Christian in the entire region that they could find. And so you could see that the idea of crusading had this religious, political, economic sort of mingling to kill and maim those who did not believe in the kind of Christianity that the Western brand had created. And we saw this focused on Muslims, on Byzantine Christians, and even also on Western heretical Christians. So we see that the Crusades were somewhat of a dark period in which you had a meshing of political and religious motives to take back some fervent territories. Now, what were the consequences for this Crusade state and for this Crusader movement? Well, there are numerous consequences that actually have deep impacts on the history of Europe. You see Crusader states, they brought wealth and trade to Italian ports, and this will inevitably, of course, give them a lot of capital and coin to invest in the arts later on. We're going to see a return of Greek and Roman knowledge as these Crusaders end up bringing back with them many ancient Greek manuscripts and books that were lost from Plato and Aristotle and Euclid and all this scientific knowledge. We're also going to see the breakdown of feudalism with all of this new wealth flooding into Europe, and particularly the dismantling of the rigid social structures of those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. When we begin to see that dismantled a little bit through the Crusade movement, we see a breakdown of that rigid feudalism that existed. And we start to see the development of strong, centralized states as each one of these people begin to establish an identity of French or German or England, which becomes a different identity and a different state identity than just Latin Christian. So we begin to see some major shifts in centralizing states and centralizing political identities. Now, the objectives were, 1, examine the unique civilization of the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, and 2, discuss how the Crusades affected medieval society in both the East and the West.